Catherine will speak on my behalf. Mrs. Meghan Markle has repeatedly written to the palace seeking our intervention in the Epstein matter, but, like Andrew, she must face her own consequences.
What if the final battle between Meghan and the monarchy was never about titles, duties, or public appearances at all? What if it was about something far more explosive? Trust. Because according to whispers surrounding the palace corridors, one devastating decision may have finally ended the last remaining hope of reconciliation. And when King Charles reportedly rejected Meghan's final plea, insiders claim the message wasn't simply a refusal. It was a declaration, a line in the sand, a royal door that had been left barely open for years was suddenly slammed shut with stunning finality. The shock wasn't just that Meghan heard no, the shock was how absolute the answer appeared to be. Not delayed, not reconsidered, not under review. Closed, one word. One brutal word carrying years of bitterness, accusations, disappointment, family fractures, and wounds that never fully healed. For Meghan, that answer reportedly landed like a thunderbolt. Sources described a woman staring at the palace response repeatedly, almost searching for hidden meaning between the lines. But there was none. No secret invitation. No coded olive branch. No sign that the freeze was thawing. The monarchy had spoken, and the answer was colder than many expected. What makes this story even more dramatic is that Meghan reportedly wasn't asking for a full-scale royal comeback. She wasn't allegedly demanding senior status, royal tours, or an official position at the center of palace life. The request was said to be smaller, but emotionally far more significant. Limited invitations, selected family access, carefully controlled appearances, a symbolic sign that the years of exclusion were finally ending. Yet even that appeared to be too much, and suddenly people began asking the same uncomfortable question. If even a modest request was rejected, what exactly happened behind palace walls that made forgiveness feel impossible? Inside royal circles, the decision reportedly weighed heavily on Charles. That is what makes this situation so fascinating. By many accounts, the king was not acting out of anger. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't seeking revenge. In fact, some accounts describe a tired monarch carrying the burden of a choice he never wanted to make. Because every rejection of Meghan also carries consequences for Harry. Every closed door creates another distance between father and son. Charles reportedly understood that reality better than anyone. Yet despite knowing the emotional cost, he still moved forward. Why? That is where the mystery deepens. Then another name reportedly entered the picture, William, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. Because according to accounts surrounding the final discussions, William's influence was impossible to ignore. He allegedly didn't need dramatic speeches. He didn't need public confrontation. His concerns were already understood. The future king reportedly viewed the situation through an entirely different lens. Where Charles may have seen family pain, William saw institutional risk. Where others saw reconciliation, William saw the possibility of reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal, and palace insiders suggest that distinction may have shaped everything that followed. The language used in the reported response became one of the biggest clues. Palace aides allegedly recognized immediately that the wording carried unusual firmness. This wasn't the language of a temporary pause. It wasn't the language of maybe later. It reportedly sounded permanent. And whenever something inside the monarchy sounds permanent, people start asking what happened behind the scenes to create such certainty? What event transformed caution into distrust? What moment convinced senior royals that reopening the door carried more danger than leaving it closed? That is where attention turns toward an earlier royal incident that continues to generate intense speculation. According to accounts referenced inside palace discussions, a private Windsor gathering became a turning point. What should have been a quiet family occasion allegedly evolved into something far more uncomfortable. Voices were raised, emotions surfaced, tensions became impossible to hide, and several people reportedly left that evening with completely different interpretations of what had happened. Meghan reportedly believed she was defending herself. Others allegedly viewed the confrontation as proof that old battles were far from over. What happened next may have changed everything. The issue reportedly centered around exclusion. Meghan allegedly felt she had been deliberately left outside key family moments. To her, every missing invitation carried meaning. Every absence felt intentional. Every closed opportunity reinforced the idea that she remained on the outside looking in. But inside palace circles, concerns were growing for different reasons. Some reportedly feared that every attempt at reconciliation eventually reopened the same arguments, the same grievances, and the same public controversies. Instead of creating peace, attempts at healing seemed to revive old conflicts, and that growing concern may have become impossible to ignore. William reportedly watched these developments closely. What disturbed him, according to accounts, was not merely disagreement. Families disagree all the time. What worried him was the possibility that trust itself had been damaged beyond repair. Once trust becomes the issue, every conversation changes. Every request carries suspicion. Every gesture gets questioned. Every olive branch looks like a potential risk. And if trust disappears completely, even the smallest request can suddenly feel dangerous. Charles allegedly found himself trapped between two impossible roles. On one side stood a father who understood the pain of separation. On the other stood a monarch responsible for protecting an institution that survives beyond any single family dispute. The crown demanded caution. The father wanted peace. And according to accounts surrounding the decision, those two responsibilities collided with extraordinary force. The result was a choice that satisfied nobody and hurt nearly everyone involved. Yet despite the pain, the palace moved forward. The file remained on the king's desk. The final wording was prepared. The decision drew closer. And behind closed doors, a confrontation was approaching that could determine whether Meghan would ever find a path back into the royal fold. The decisive moment reportedly arrived behind closed palace doors, far away from cameras, headlines, and public opinion. No grand ceremony, no dramatic announcement, just a small circle of senior figures facing a question that had haunted the royal family for years. Should Meghan be allowed back in, even in a limited capacity? According to accounts surrounding the discussion, Charles sat with the request before him while William remained firm in his position. What made the atmosphere so tense was not shouting or conflict, it was the silence. The kind of silence that appears when everyone already understands the consequences before a single word is spoken. Every person in that room reportedly knew they were not deciding an invitation. They were deciding the future shape of the royal family itself. As the final wording was debated, William allegedly argued that softer language would create false hope, and false hope, in his view, had already created enough damage. The future king reportedly believed that leaving any opening, no matter how small, would only guarantee another cycle of expectation, disappointment, speculation, and public drama. Charles reportedly hated the harshness of the decision, but the more he examined the situation, the more trapped he appeared to feel. He understood that reopening palace channels might satisfy emotions in the short term, but he also feared it could reignite tensions the monarchy had spent years trying to contain. The burden of kingship suddenly became impossible to separate from the burden of fatherhood. Then came the moment that changed everything. According to reports described in the transcript, Charles finally reached his conclusion. The decision was not delivered with triumph. It was delivered with exhaustion. A man carrying both family heartbreak and royal responsibility allegedly looked down at the file and effectively accepted that some wounds could not be repaired through another negotiation. Once the decision was made, palace machinery moved quickly. Statements were prepared. Communication teams acted. Senior aides reportedly understood that speed was essential because hesitation would create rumors, leaks, and competing narratives. The monarchy wanted control of the message before the story controlled them. For Meghan, however, none of that palace discipline softened the impact. The response reportedly arrived through private channels before public confirmation reached the headlines. That meant she had only moments to absorb the rejection before the entire world would begin discussing it. The wording itself reportedly left almost no room for interpretation. No restored access, no symbolic return, no pathway back into the official royal structure. Each sentence appeared carefully designed to remove ambiguity, and perhaps that was what hurt the most, not uncertainty. Certainty, Harry reportedly recognized the significance immediately. According to the narrative, he watched Meghan absorb the decision in near silence, and that silence frightened him more than anger ever could. Anger can fight, anger can argue, anger can negotiate. Silence often means acceptance of a reality nobody wanted to face. The rejection was no longer about royal invitations. It became something much larger. It became a verdict on trust, belonging, and the possibility of rebuilding relationships that had had fractured under years of public scrutiny. Then came what many considered the emotional climax of the entire saga, a private conversation between Charles and Meghan. No palace aides, no official statements, no carefully crafted press language, just two people separated by years of disappointment and conflicting expectations. Meghan reportedly asked a devastating question. Was there ever a version of her return that could have been accepted? According to the account, Charles paused before answering, and sometimes a pause reveals more than words ever can. The king allegedly explained that trust could not be restored through announcements or symbolic gestures. Trust, once broken, required something deeper, something the institution no longer believed it possessed. The conversation reportedly ended without anger, but somehow that made it even sadder. There were no dramatic accusations, no final explosion, just an acceptance that both sides viewed the past through completely different lenses. Meghan understood the door was not being closed temporarily. Charles understood the pain his decision would cause, yet neither changed course. The call ended, the palace position remained, and a chapter that had remained slightly open for years finally appeared to close. By the following morning, the private decision had become a public spectacle. Headlines spread, commentators debated, crowds gathered outside palace gates. Everyone had an opinion. Yet inside the royal family, the emotional reality was far more complicated than any newspaper headline could capture. Charles had chosen duty over sentiment. William had chosen protection over reconciliation. Meghan had lost the final hope of a palace-approved return, and Harry found himself standing between two worlds that seemed farther apart than ever. In the end, the real story was never simply about access. It was about trust. It was about whether broken bonds can truly be repaired once suspicion replaces confidence. And according to this account, the monarchy reached its answer. The door was not left open, it was not left unlocked, it was closed. And the sound of that closure echoed far beyond palace walls, leaving behind a family forever changed and a story that may continue unfolding long after the headlines disappear.